first part out. But how you doing, Doc Gaffney?
I'm good, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a chiropractic physician. Been in practice for about 58 years now, and became interested in skydiving shortly after I got out of the military. I was drafted into the Navy way back when, and eventually ended up going into the Naval Air, training in Pensacola. And one of the things that happened along the way is that I joined a trampoline exhibition team that followed the Blue Angels around as a ground entertainment for the Navy. And the story was, if we made that team, we got our choice of advanced training, whether it was helicopter, jets, or lighter than air, or whatever. That wasn't true, but I tried. And somewhere in about 1957, the Navy had difficulties in jumping out of a T-28 trainer. This was a big 800 horsepower radial engine craft that eventually became 1,400 horsepower, and that the people who had to jump out of that aircraft often hit the tail. So they recruited our trampoline exhibition team to try to figure out how to make that work better. So they put us in a big hangar, tied the aircraft down, put it up at high RPM, and had us jump out of the airplane while they slow motion filmed that. And it turned out that the seat on that aircraft was fairly high, and when they tried to jump out, they were too high and they hit the tail. So we, as a result of that, we figured out that you need to have a small handle attached to the side of the fuselage. And if you reach for that handle, that puts you way down and you miss the tail by a mile. Anyway, that was quite an interesting experience. It's about 6 of us did that, and we did a number of exits from that aircraft like that. As a result, I became interested in actually doing it out of that aircraft, but the Navy, being the Navy, wouldn't let us do it. They sent that idea to the Naval Parachute Center in California. And as a result of that, it did become the way to get out of that aircraft. Later on, they put an injection seat in that aircraft, and that nullified the whole thing. So as soon as I got out of the aircraft, I wanted to try a parachute jump, which I did. We started at the static line jumps in a big turnip field at the University of Florida, and then came down to DeLand and established a group from that beginning. And we called this group Falling Angels Incorporated, and we had a lot of fun. We jumped out of mostly a four-place airplane at that time. We managed to find a way to get a STC to take the door off and hinge it at the top so that it swung upward, so we had a better exit from that aircraft. I jumped for about 10 years. At the same time I was flying, at the same time I was diving, scuba diving.
Okay, how was it coming to DeLand and getting permission to jump on the airport and getting facilities?
Actually, we contacted the FAA, which was another entity at that time, and they said, we really don't care where you jump, just jump over any people. So we went ahead and jumped at the airport. At that time, there was a tower on the airport, and we eventually rented that tower for our headquarters, and we jumped out of that thing for a number of years. They finally took it down. The difference between a club and a commercial operation is pretty major. We acted like we were a athletic team, and the companionship and so forth, and that was quite different. When the jumping became more commercial, in other words, had larger aircraft, and they take more people at a time, and eventually the club idea kind of faded away, and with that my interest faded away somewhat. Yeah, the Falling Angels was an interesting club. We made it a non-profit corporation, and we did a lot of exhibition jumps. At that time, parachuting was relatively rare, and I can recall I jumped into the Daytona 500 twice, last time landing on a pregnant lady. We often were called on to jump with the opening of a new restaurant or a bar, and I jumped as Santa Claus, I jumped as in six-gun territory with a cowboy hat on, which I lost on the way down. We had a lot of fun doing that, and that proceeded for about 10 years for me. As the evolution of chutes changed, they became much more controllable. We had only round canopies that we had to modify. So when we would order or find a canopy, oftentimes it was surplus and had no idea how old it was or when it was packed, if it was packed. And after a while, the surplus people figured out what we were doing, and they cut the lines off. So we had a hard time getting canopies. And the United States parachute team helped us a lot in that regard. They found some canopies for us. And we would take a razor blade and cut the gores out to make it steerable. And then with a cigarette lighter, we'd melt the edges where we cut so it wouldn't run. And that's how we did it. We started out with cutting one gore out on each side to make it steerable, and eventually we had 2 or 3 out, and we picked up a little speed that way, but still fairly uncontrollable. In other words, it would hold the wind about 8 miles an hour and come straight down. New canopies will hold almost 30 miles an hour and come straight down. On the other hand, if you come downwind in a new canopy, you could land really hard if you didn't turn into the wind. And most of the injuries that occurred in our group were people trying to turn too low or not figuring out where their exit point was properly and landing in a tree, which I did about 7 times.
Yeah, there are a lot of trees around the airport, especially in those days.
Yes.
Do you recall when they tore down the old Navy Tower and you moved into the radio shack?
Yes, I do recall. I don't recall when that happened, but we had one incident where one of our jumpers, Gary Dupree, for example, I'm on D-127, I think he was D-126, if I'm not mistaken. He came to us as a 16-year-old, and we kind of discouraged him from joining because we thought he was too young. Came back the next day with written permission from his parents and the money to do it, and he became a very influential jumper with our group. Gary jumped one time without a parachute into a lake out of a J3, going about in a 30-mile-an-hour wind. It was just like jumping off the back of a boat. At that time, I was appointed area safety officer by the USPA, and it was my job to keep that sort of thing from happening, but it happened anyway, along with taking a novice parachutist to 13,000 feet, following him with 2 jumpers, and making sure he pulled his ripcord. That was novel at the time. In our competition years, I think we initiated some really interesting jumps. We had a tracking contest, for example, wherein we packed a 5-pound bag of flour in our parachute bag. We would have the airplane come down towards the end of the runway, and he would have us exit by radio contact from the ground, and then we'd track back the other direction from the runway, and we measured where the sack of flour hit to determine who won that tracking contest. That was interesting. As far as I know, that hasn't been done before. We also initiated a freestyle competition way before they did this out west, I think. And that was interesting. We judged that like a dive. The jumper would tell us what maneuvers he was going to do ahead of time, and then we would judge on how accurately he performed those maneuvers. That was interesting. We had one thing we used to do that was a lot of fun, we would take a relatively new jumper and have him put on a blindfold. He would have 3 or 4 jumps under his belt, pre-falls, and we put him on a blindfold on him and take him out over a nearby field, not knowing where he was, take the blindfold off and jump right there. And then we timed him for how long it took him to get back to the airport, however he could. That was kind of a rite of passage type thing. And we had a lot of fun. We had a few accidents. I broke my left femur once. Eventually had to have my knee replaced. Compression fracture of T12 vertebra and about 5 tailbones. So we were kind of beat up. As you probably have experienced, when old jumpers get together, they talk about how many screws they've got in their body and that sort of thing.
The Falling Angels hosted a lot of competitions, is that
Yes,
right?
we did. We used to host, traditionally, we had the first Southeast Conference competition, and we judged accuracy and style. And we did that for a number of years, actually. We competed in a national competition. One of our efforts was to go to Issaquah, Washington, just outside of Seattle, for a national competition. I broke my tailbone on the second jump on that one, so we didn't do too well. We came back in that 4-place airplane all the way back from Issaquah, Washington. I had to sit there with that tailbone hurting like mad. We came into the land area. There was a big thunderstorm over the airport, so we decided to jump into the water in St. John's River and then go from there. So we did, but the wind was really picking up. I landed in a tree. By that time it was absolutely dark. I was hanging by one ankle in a tree, not knowing how high I was. So I opened my reserve parachute, climbed down the reserve parachute, and I still couldn't see the ground. So I swung over to the tree and shimmied down the tree, and it turned out I was about 20 feet high from the ground even at that. Came back the next day and cut the tree down. We had a few injuries, most of the time with sprained ankles, occasional fractured leg. At that time we all wore helmets, we all wore boots, and it was just the thing to do at the time. Nowadays you see people going out with bare feet, no helmet, and it's quite different. But the equipment made a big difference. I became a rigger, and I was flying at the time. I received my single multi-engine instrument ratings, and at the time I was scuba diving at the same time. So it was pretty active 10 years of activity. Some of the people that we came across were interesting people. I wrote down a number of members that I could remember. I have a bunch of old pictures from our competition. This picture was one of our national teams. All right.
Yeah. Would you want him to take photos?
He can take the whole thing if he wants. One of the people that came to us was Tim Saltonstall. I don't know if you remember him.
Yeah.
Tim was a national champion at one time. He came from California and eventually went back to California. He lived over a bar in Daytona Beach, and it was an interesting experience for him, I'm sure. Tim was the grandson of Senator Saltonstall from Massachusetts. Let's see what else we had. And Tommy Orr was a local fire chief in the land. We had a jumper from Canada who was a national champion. Every time we had a competition, he would show up. We had a judge that came with us on one of these competitions. It was Squeaky Charette. I don't know if you know him or not. Squeaky was a first sergeant in the Army, and he was principal in developing the Army parachute team and halo operations for the Army. We became pretty good friends. he helped us get some canopies. And I can recall Squeaky was interviewed to become a CIA member, and I asked him to tell me about that interview, which was funny. He received a piece of paper with the name of a building and the number of the office in that building that he was supposed to go to. So he knocked on the door, and he went in. There was a lady in there and a man in there, both in civic clothes, and a bunch of equipment. And the lady said, "Who are you?" And without missing a beat, he said, "Bond, James Bond." That was funny. I had heard that he was later killed somewhere in Asia, but it turned out I looked on a computer the other day and I found what happened to him, and he was in fact a major contributor to the CIA operations in a number of different countries. And he went from the rank of first sergeant. By the time he retired, he was a major general. So he was a very interesting fellow, and quite a good jumper too. Let's see what else we have.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and state your name and your D license number, and I think that is about as long as it will run.
Okay. I'm John Gaffney. I'm D127.
And how many jumps did you make?
I make about 1,000 jumps,
Okay.
a little over 1,000.
All right.